The Futility of Schooling by Illich, a collective reading.
To provide every citizen in the United States with a level of schooling now enjoyed by the well-off one-third would require the addition of $40 billion per year to the present cost of elementary and secondary education in the United States, which is about $37 billion. This sum exceeds the present expenditure for the war in Vietnam. Evidently, the United States is too poor to provide compensatory education on this scale. And yet, it is politically inexpedient and intellectually disreputable to question the elusive goal of providing equal educational opportunities for all citizens just by giving them access to an equal number of years in school. One man's illusions are often best recognized in the light of another man's delusions. My discussion of the futility of schooling in the Third World, published as a magazine article in 1968, may help to demonstrate the general futility of worldwide educational institutions.
For the past 2 decades, demographic considerations have colored all discussion about development in Latin America. In 1950, some 200 million people occupied the area extending from Mexico to Chile. Of these, 120 million lived directly or indirectly on primitive agriculture. Assuming both effective population controls and the most favorable possible results from programs aimed at the increase of agriculture, by 1985, 40 million people will produce most of the food for a total population of 360 million.
The remaining 320 million will either be marginal to the economy or will have to be incorporated somehow into urban living and industrial production. During these same past 20 years, both Latin American governments and foreign technical assistance agencies have come to rely increasingly on the capacity of grammar, trade, and high schools to lead the non-rural majority out of its marginality in shanty towns and subsistence farms into the type of factory, market, and public forums which correspond to modern technology.
It was assumed that schooling will eventually produce a broad middle class with values resembling those of highly industrialized nations, despite the economy of continuous scarcity. Accumulating evidence now indicates that schooling does not and cannot produce the expected results.
Some years ago, the governments of the Americas joined in the Alliance for Progress, which has in practice served mainly the progress of the middle class in the Latin nations. In most countries, the alliance has encouraged the replacement of a closed, feudal, hereditary elite by one which is supposedly meritocratic and open to the few who manage to finish schools.
Concomitantly, the urban service proletariat has grown at several times the rate of the traditional landless rural mass and has replaced it in importance. The marginal majority and the schooled minority grow ever further apart. One old feudal society has brought forth two classes,
separate and unequal.
This development has led to educational research focused on the improvement of the learning process in schools and on the adaptations of schools themselves to the special circumstances prevailing in underdeveloped societies. But logic would seem to require that we do not stop with an effort to improve schools. Rather, that we question the assumption on which the school system itself is based. We must not exclude the possibility that the emerging nations cannot be schooled, that schooling is not a viable answer to their need for universal education.
Perhaps this type of insight is needed to clear the way for a futuristic scenario in which schools as we know them today would disappear. The social distance between the growing urban mass and the new elite is a new phenomenon, unlike the traditional forms of discrimination known in Latin America. This new discrimination is not a transitory thing which can be overcome by schooling.
On the contrary, I submit that one of the reasons for the awakening frustration in the majorities is the progressive acceptance of the liberal myth, the assumption that schooling is an assurance of social integration, the solidarity of all citizens based on their common graduation from school has been an inalienable part of the modern Western self-image.
Colonization has not succeeded in implanting this myth equally in all countries, but everywhere schooling has become the prerequisite for membership in a managerial middle class.
The constitutional history of Latin America since its independence has made the masses of this continent particularly susceptible to the conviction that all citizens have a right to enter and therefore have some possibility of entering their society through the door of a school.
More than elsewhere, in Latin America, the teacher as missionary for the school gospel has found adherents at the grassroots. Only a few years ago, many of us were happy when finally the Latin American school system was singled out as the area of privileged investment for international assistance funds. In fact, during the past years, both national budgets and private investment have been stimulated to increase educational allocation.
A second look reveals that this school system has built a narrow bridge across a widening social gap. As the only legitimate passage to the middle class, the school restricts all unconventional crossings and leaves the underachiever to bear the blame for his marginality. This statement is difficult for Americans to understand. In the United States, the 19th century persuasion that free schooling ensures all citizens equality in the economy and effective participation in society survives.
It is by no means certain that the result of schooling ever measure up to this expectation. But the school certainly played a more prominent role in this process some 100 years ago. In the United States of the mid-19th century, 6 years of schooling frequently made a young man the educational superior of his book. In a society largely dominated by on-school achievers, the Little Red Schoolhouse was an effective road to social equality.
A few years in school for all brought most extremes together. Those who achieved power and money without schooling had to accept a degree of equality with those who achieved literacy and did not strike it rich. Computers, television, and airplanes have changed this. Today in Latin America, in the midst of modern technology, 3 times as many years of schooling and 20 times as much money as was then spent on grammar schools will not produce the same social.
The dropout from the 6th grade is unable to find a job even as a punch card operator or a railroad hand. Contemporary Latin America needs school systems no more than it needs railroad tracks. Both, spanning continents, serve to speed the now rich and established nations into the industrial age. Both, if now handled with care, are harmless heirlooms from the Victorian period, but neither is relevant to countries emerging from primitive agriculture directly into the jet age. Latin America cannot afford to maintain outmoded social institutions amid modern technological processes.
By school, of course, I do not mean all organized formal education. I use the term school and schooling here to designate a form of childcare and a rite de passage which we take for granted. We forget that this institution and the corresponding creed appeared on the scene only with the growth of the industrial state.
Comprehensive schooling today involves year-round, obligatory, and universal classroom attendance in small groups for several hours each day. It is imposed on all citizens for a period of 10 to 18 years. School divides life into 2 segments, which are increasingly of comparable length. As much as anything else, schooling implies custodial care for persons who are declared undesirable elsewhere by the simple fact that a school has been built to serve them.
The school is supposed to take the excess population from the street, the family, or the labor force. Teachers are given the power to invent new criteria according to which new segments of the population may be committed to a school. This restraint on healthy, productive, and potentially independent human beings is performed by schools with an economy which only labor camps could rival. Schooling also involves a process of accepted ritual certification for all members of a schooled society.
Schools select those who are bound to succeed and send them on their way with a patch marking them fit. Once universal schooling has been accepted as the hallmark for the members of a society, fitness is measured by the amount of time and money spent on formal education in youth, rather than the ability acquired independently from an accredited curriculum.
A first important step toward radical educational reform in Latin America will be taken when the educational system of the United States is accepted for what it is, a recent, imaginative social invention perfected since World War II and historically rooted in the American frontier.
The creation of the all-pervasive school establishment tied into industry, government, and military is an invention no less original than the guild-centered apprenticeship of the Middle Ages, or the Doctrina de los Indios, and the reduction of Spanish missionaries in Mexico and Paraguay, respectively, or the Lycée and Los Condes Écoles in France.
Each one of these systems was produced by its society to give stability to an achievement. Each has been heavily pervaded by ritual to which society bowed. And each has been rationalized into an all-embracing persuasion, religion, or ideology. The United States is not the first nation that has been willing to pay a high price to have its educational system exported by missionaries to all corners of the world. The colonization of Latin America by the Catechism is certainly a noteworthy precedent.
It is difficult now to challenge the school as a system because we are so used to it. Our industrial categories tend to define results as products of specialized institutions and instruments. Armies produce defense for countries. Churches produce salvation in an afterlife. Binet defined intelligence as that which his tests test. Why not then conceive of education as the product of schools? Once this tag has been accepted, and schooled education gives the impression of something spurious, illegitimate, and certainly unaccredited.
For some generations, education has been based on massive schooling, just as security was based on massive retaliation, and at least in the United States, transportation on the family car. The United States, because it industrialized earlier, is rich enough to afford the schools, the strategic air command, and the car, no matter what the toll. Most nations of the world are not that rich. They behave, however, as if they were. The examples of nations which made it leads Brazilians to pursue the ideal of the family car, just for a few.
It compels Peruvians to squander on Mirage bombers, just for a show. And it drives every government in Latin America to spend up to 2/5 of its total budget on schools, and to do so unchallenged. Let us insist for a moment on this analogy between the school system and the system of transportation based on the family car. Ownership of a car is now rapidly becoming the ideal in Latin America, at least among those who have a voice in formulating national goals.
During the last 20 years, roads, parking facilities, and services for private automobiles have been immensely improved. These improvements benefit overwhelmingly those who have their own cars, that is, a tiny percentage.
The bias of the budget allocated for transportation thus discriminates against the best transportation for the greatest number. And the huge capital investments in this area ensure that this bias is here to stay.
In some countries, articulate minorities now challenge the family car as the fundamental unit of transportation in emerging societies. But everywhere in Latin America, it would be political suicide to advocate radical limitations on the multiplication of schools. Opposition parties may challenge at times the need for superhighways or the need for weapons, which will see active duty only in a parade. But what man in his right mind would challenge the need to provide every child with the chance to go to high school?
Before poor nations could reach this point of universal schooling, however, their ability to educate would be exhausted. Even 10 or 12 years of schooling are beyond 85% of all men of our century. if they happen to live outside the tiny islands where capital accumulates. Nowhere in Latin America do 27% of any age group get beyond the 6th grade, nor do more than 1% graduate from a university.
Yet no government spends less than 18% of its budget on schools, and many spend more than 30%.
Universal schooling, as a concept has been defined recently in industrial societies, is obviously beyond their means.
The annual cost of schooling a United States citizen between the ages of 12 and 24 equals as much as most Latin Americans earn in 2 or 3 years.
Schools will stay beyond the means of the developing nations. Neither radical population control nor maximum reallocation of government budgets, nor unprecedented foreign aid would end the present infeasibility of school systems aimed at 12 years of schooling for all. Population control needs time to become effective when the total population is as young as that of tropical America.
The percentage of the world's resources invested in schooling cannot be raised beyond certain levels, nor can this budget grow beyond foreseeable maximal rates. Finally, foreign aid would have to increase to 30% of the receiving nation's national budget to provide effectively for schooling, a goal not to be anticipated.
Furthermore, the per capita cost of schooling itself is rising everywhere as schools accept those who are difficult to teach. As the retention rate rises and as the quality of schooling itself improves. This rise in costs neutralizes much of the new investments. Schools do not come cheaper by the dozen.
In view of all these factors, increases in school budget must usually be defended by arguments which imply default. In fact, however, schools are untouchable because they are vital to the status quo.
Schools have the effect of tempering the subversive potential of education in an alienated society because, if education is confined to schools, only those who have been schooled into compliance on a lower grade are admitted to its higher reaches. In capital-starved societies not rich enough to purchase unlimited schooling, the majority is schooled not only into compliance, but also into subservience.
Since Latin American constitutions were written with an eye on the United States, the ideal of universal schooling was a creative utopia. It was a condition necessary to create the Latin American 19th century bourgeoisie. Without the pretense that every citizen has the right to go to school, the liberal bourgeoisie could never have developed. Neither could the middle-class masses of the present-day Europe, the United States, and Russia, nor the managerial middle elite of their cultural colonies in South America.
But the same school, which has worked in the last century to overcome feudalism, has now become an oppressive idol, which protects those who are already schooled. Schools grade, and therefore they degrade. They make the degraded accept his own submission. Social seniority is bestowed according to the level of schooling achieved.
Everywhere in Latin America, more money for schools means more privilege for a few at the cost of most. And this patronage of an elite is explained as a political ideal. This ideal is written into laws, which state the patently impossible: equal scholastic opportunities for all.
The number of satisfied clients who graduate from schools every year is much smaller than the number of frustrated dropouts who are conveniently graded by their failure for use in a marginal labor pool. The resulting steep educational pyramid defines a rationale for the corresponding levels of social status.
The move from the farm to the city in Latin America still frequently means a move from a world where status is explained as a result of inheritance into a world where it is explained as a result of schooling.
Schools allow a head start to be rationalized as an achievement. They give to privilege not only the appearance of equality, but also of generosity. Should somebody who missed out on early schooling be dissatisfied with the status he holds, he can always be referred to a night school or trade school. If he does not take advantage of such recognized remedies, his exclusion from privilege can be explained as his own fault.
Schools temper the frustration they provoke. The school system also inculcates its own universal acceptance. Some schooling is not necessarily more education than none, especially in a country where every year a few more people can get all the schooling they want, while most people never complete the sixth grade.
But much less than 6 years seems to be more than sufficient to inculcate in the child the acceptance of the ideology that comes with the school grade. The child learns only about the superior status and unquestioned authority of those who have more schooling than he does. Any discussions of radical alternatives to school-centered formal education upsets our notions of society.
No matter how inefficient schools are in educating the majority, no matter how effective schools are in limiting the access to the elite, no matter how liberally schools shower their non-educational benefits on the members of this elite, schools do increase the national income. They qualify their graduates for more economic production.
In an economy on the lower rungs of development towards United States-type industrialization, a school graduate is enormously more productive than a dropout. Schools are part and parcel of a society in which a minority is on the way to becoming so productive that the majority must be schooled into disciplined consumption.
Schooling, therefore, under the best circumstances, helps to divide society into two groups. Those so productive that their expectation of annual rise in their personal income lies far beyond the national average, and the overwhelming majority whose income also rises, but at a rate clearly below the former's. Those rates are, of course, compounded and leave the two groups apart.
Radical innovation in formal education presupposes radical political changes, radical changes in the organization of production, and radical changes in man's image of himself as an animal which needs school. This is often forgotten when sweeping reforms of the schools are proposed and fail because of the societal framework we accept.
For instance, the trade school is sometimes advocated as a cure-all for mass schooling, yet it is doubtful that the products of trade schools would find employment in a continuously changing, ever more automated economy. Moreover, the capital and operating costs of trade schools, as we know them today, are several times as high as those for a standard school of the same grade.
Also, trade schools usually take in sixth graders, who, as we have seen, are already the exception. Trade schools pretend to educate by creating a spurious facsimile of the factory within the school building. Instead of the trade school, we should think of a subsidized transformation of the industrial plant.
It should be possible to obligate factories to serve as training centers during off hours, for managers to spend time planning and supervising this training, and for the industrial process to be so redesigned that it has educational value. If the expenditures for present schools were partly allocated to sponsor this kind of educational exploitation of existing resources, then the final results, both economic and educational, might be incomparably greater.
If that apprenticeship were offered not only to employees, industry would begin to assume this important role that is now being played by schools. And we would be on our way to disabuse the idea that manpower qualification precedes employment and that schooling precedes productive work.
There's no reason for us to continue the medieval tradition in which men prepare for the secular world by incarceration in a sacred precinct, be it monastery, synagogue, or school. A second frequently discussed remedy for the failure of schools is fundamental, or adult education.
It has been proven by Paulo Freire in Brazil that those adults who can be interested in political issues of their communities can be made literate within 6 weeks of evening classes. The program teaching such reading and writing skills, of course, must be built around the emotion-loaded keywords of adults' political vocabulary. Understandably, this fact has gotten Freire's program into trouble.
It has also been suggested that the dollar cost of 10 separate months of adult education is equal to that of 1 year of early schooling and can be incomparably more effective than schooling at its best. Unfortunately, adult education now is conceived principally as a device to give the underprivileged a palliative for the schooling he lacks.
This situation would be reversed if we wanted to conceive of all education as an exercise in adulthood. We should consider a radical reduction of the length of the formal, obligatory school session to only 2 months each year, but spread this time of formal schooling over the first 20 or 30 years of a man's life.
While various forms of in-service apprenticeship in factories and programmed math and language teaching could assume a large proportion of what we have previously called instruction, 2 months a year of formal schooling could be considered ample time for what Greeks meant by schooling, leisure for the pursuit of insight.
No wonder we find it near impossible to conceive of a comprehensive social changes in which the educational functions of school would thus be redistributed in new patterns among institutions we do not now envisage. We find it equally difficult to indicate concrete ways in which the non-educational functions of a vanishing school system would be redistributed.
We don't know what to do with those whom we now label children or students and coming to school.
It is difficult to foresee the political consequences of changes as fundamental as those proposed, not to mention the international consequences. How should a school-reared society coexist with one which has gone off the school standard and whose industry, commerce, advertising, and participation in politics is different as a matter of principle?
Areas which develop outside the universal school standard would lack common language and criteria for respectful coexistence with the school. Two such worlds, such as China and the United States, might almost have to seal themselves off from each other.
Rashly, the school-bred mind abhors the educational devices available in these worlds. It is difficult mentally to accredit Mao's party as an educational institution which might prove more effective than the schools are at their best, at least when it comes to inculcating citizenship. Guerrilla warfare in Latin America is another education device much more frequently misused or misunderstood than applied.
Che Guevara, for instance, clearly saw it as the last educational resort to teach people about the illegitimacy of their political system, especially in unschooled countries, where the transistor radio has come to every village. We must never underrate the educational functions of great charismatic dissidents, like Tom Helder Camara in Brazil or Camilo Torres in Colombia. Castro described his early charismatic heritages as teaching sessions.
The school mind perceives this process as exclusively as political indoctrination, and their educational purpose eludes its grasp. The legitimation of education by schools tends to render all non-school education an accident, if not an outright misdemeanor. And yet, it is surprising with what difficulty the school-bred mind perceives the rigor with which schools inculcate their own presumed necessity, and with it, the supposed inevitability of the system they sponsor.
Schools indoctrinate the child into the acceptance of the political system his teachers represent, despite the claim that teaching is non-political. Ultimately, the cult of schooling will lead to violence, as the establishment of any religion has led to it. If the gospel of universal schooling is permitted to spread in Latin America, the military's ability to repress insurgency must grow.
Only force will ultimately control the propagation of the school myth enkindles. The maintenance of the present school system may turn out to be an important step on the way to Latin American fascism.
Only fanaticism inspired by idolatry of a system can ultimately rationalize the massive discrimination which will result from another 20 years of grading a capital-starved society by school marks.
The time has come to recognize the real burden of the schools in the emerging nations so that we may become free of the envisaged change in the social structure, which now makes schools a necessity.
I do not advocate a sweeping utopia like the Chinese Commune for Latin America, but I do suggest that we plunge our imagination into the construction of scenarios which would allow a bold reallocation of educational functions among industry, politics, short scholastic retreats, and intensive preparation of parents for providing early childhood education.
The cost of schools must be measured not only in economic, social, and educational terms, but in political terms as well. Schools, in an economy of scarcity invaded by automation, accentuate and rationalize the coexistence of two societies, one a colony of the other.
Once it is understood that the cost of schooling is not inferior to the cost of chaos, we might be on the brink of courageously costly compromise. Today, it is as dangerous in America to question the myth of social salvation through schooling as it was 300 years ago to question the divine rights of the Catholic kings.